Detectives now hold two conflicting accounts of the night Lynette Hooker vanished.
One came from Brian Hooker, the other was pulled from his own device.
And according to federal agents close to the case, those two stories simply do not match.
Let that sink in.
Because this probe initially looked like nothing more than a tragic maritime accident. A husband and wife, a tiny dinghy, pitch black water, a reported fall, and one person returning alone. But as detectives dug deeper, the story ran into something it could not explain. Cold, hard data. Not rumors or online theories, just data.
A marine tracking app silently logging coordinates in the background.
An 11-hour blackout from the vessel's tracking system.
A sailboat seized by federal agents. And an infrared camera that was quietly recording everything without anyone realizing it. Right now, deep inside an FBI forensics lab, investigators are analyzing digital evidence pulled directly from the boat at the center of this mystery, trying to answer a single question that only grows more troubling over time. Not where Lynette Hooker is, but whether the account of her disappearance is actually true. And it all starts with one crucial timestamp, 9:29 p.m.
April 4th, 2025, in the Bahamas. That is the exact moment the vessel Soulmate went dark on tracking screens.
For the next 11 hours, no one outside that sailboat knew where it was. No one knew what happened on board. No one knew what was happening during the very hours that investigators are now focusing on. Then, the tracker suddenly came back online. The sailboat reappeared, but Lynette Hooker was gone. And what detectives have since uncovered could entirely reshape how we view this whole mystery. Before we go on, this video covers a real missing person case with potentially disturbing details. Viewer discretion is advised. To understand why detectives are focusing so intensely on those 11 hours, we must return to the very beginning, to the retirement dream that first drew Lynette and Brian to the Bahamas. Long before agents began pulling GPS tracking records,
Before federal agents seized the Soulmate,
before forensics experts began analyzing hard drives in a lab, there was a totally different side to this story. A narrative that seemed almost flawless from the outside. Spring 2025, crystal clear Bahamian waters, quiet island harbors, days dictated by tides and weather, not by work schedules or morning alarms. For Lynette and Brian, this was no temporary vacation. This was their reality.
for years, they had been working toward a goal that most people only dream about.
Shedding their old life, buying a yacht, and sailing off into the horizon. Their vessel was named Soulmate, a floating home, a retirement dream, a life defined by freedom. To those who knew them and watched their online videos, sailing was far more than a simple hobby. It was everything.
They spent years sharing their entire life on the water.
Restoring the boat, cruising, and living aboard full-time. Video after video captured them working side by side, painting sun-baked decks, crossing open waters, visiting coastal towns, and planning the next escape. Lynette always looked comfortable on the water. She was no stranger to boating, no novice to the sea. Lynette was a woman who had spent years living this life. A wife, a devoted mother, an experienced sailor who traded her safe, routine life on land for something unpredictable, yet incredibly freeing. And for many years, it seemed to be the exact life she wanted. In one home video, Lynette smiles as the Soulmate prepares to leave Texas for open seas. "We are finally leaving Kima," she says excitedly, as their great adventure begins. Back then, it truly felt like the start of a beautiful new chapter. No one watching those videos could have predicted where that story would end. Because along the way, this couple became a symbol of something much larger. They were the ones who actually got away, the ones who escaped. No office, no daily commute, no mind-numbing routine, just a sailboat, the open ocean, and another harbor waiting over the horizon.
By early 2025, the waters of the Bahamas had become their home. The Hooker family had been cruising the Caribbean and coastal waters for years,
sharing snippets of their quiet journey online as they went. To onlookers, their life seemed incredibly peaceful, almost enviable. But what makes this mystery so chilling is how every happy photo before Lynette vanished
feels entirely disconnected from the dark reality that followed.
When detectives finally started piecing together the events of April 4th, they were not dealing with some mysterious ghost ship in a crime drama.
This was the exact vessel that had carried this retired couple through years of adventures.
The very same boat featured in countless family photos. The boat that had become their floating home. That haunting contrast matters.
You see, this chilling case does not start at an active crime scene.
It begins with two people heading back from shore on what should have been a quick routine trip to their boat.
An ordinary ride, so completely routine that neither of them could suspect.
It would be the very last night Lynette Hooker was ever seen alive. According to her husband, Brian Hooker,
everything went wrong between Hopetown and the Soulmate on April 4th, 2025.
Hopetown is incredibly beautiful. Brightly colored cottages, narrow pathways, and crystal-clear, pristine waters.
It is the exact kind of place people go to escape daily pressures. And for Lynette and Brian Hooker, this harbor was supposed to be just another pleasant stop on their years-long journey. As dusk approached, the couple got ready to leave land and return to their vessel,
the Soulmate, anchored safely offshore.
Nothing about the evening seemed strange. They had likely made this exact trip hundreds of times before.
To travel back and forth between the beach and their boat, they used a tiny 8-foot dinghy.
A basic vessel designed for short trips. Not for rough, open waters, and definitely not for traveling far after dark. Just a basic tender to get them back to their floating home.
According to Brian Hooker, they set off from Hopetown at around 7:30 that evening.
By then, the daylight was fading.
The sun had slipped below the horizon, and conditions on the water were growing increasingly rough.
Brian would later report surprisingly rough seas. The wind picked up, and the weather turned bad. These details matter because, by his own account, what happened next happened in a flash.
Somewhere in the dark waters between Hopetown and the Soulmate, Lynette Hooker went overboard.
Through it all, Brian's story never really changed. He claims Lynette fell over and that she was holding the dinghy's ignition key the exact second she hit the water.
And when she slipped beneath the dark waves, he says that key went down with her. That single detail would become the absolute core of his entire explanation. Because in Brian's mind, losing that key meant losing the motor entirely.
And without that motor, he had absolutely no realistic chance of quickly tracking down Lynette in the waves.
Instead, he claims he tried to reach her by hand.
He later spoke of his frantic struggle to get back to her. But he claims the relentless wind and current just kept dragging them further apart.
Each second stretched the gap. Every passing minute crushed the hope of finding her.
Eventually, he claims she vanished completely. Think about the grim scene investigators faced when they first heard this.
A solitary husband in a tiny boat, pitch black, empty ocean.
A dead motor, no sign of Lynette, 0 witnesses, no camera footage. Absolutely no objective record of what truly happened during those critical moments.
On the surface, it played out like a tragic sea accident.
The type of disaster that strikes in mere seconds, the kind that leaves behind far more questions than answers. Yet, right from the start, certain details emerged that detectives would eventually have to unravel. Why did Lynette have the starter key? And when exactly did she fall in?
How much time did Brian actually spend trying to reach her?
Which path did that small boat really take afterward? And the biggest mystery of all, what occurred in the hours that followed?
Because Brian claims that after he lost her, he kept drifting alone in the dark.
Hours dragged by in the pitch black before he finally steered toward Marsh Harbor,
pulling in during the early morning of April 5th.
Right then, the whole situation looked exactly like the nightmare they feared.
A horrific accident at sea, a missing wife, a shattered husband, and a massive search effort getting underway. But detectives would soon dig up a detail that completely shattered their initial timeline. An event that occurred while Lynette was still lost. A log stamped at exactly 9:29 p.m. Right then, the Soulmate completely stopped broadcasting its coordinates to the world. At the start, detectives were only focused on answering one very simple question. Where did Lynette Hooker go? But as weeks went by, a darker question started to surface. This was a question that had absolutely nothing to do with witnesses, interviews, or personal memory. It was all about a single timestamp, 9:29 p.m.
Because while detectives were piece by piece reconstructing April 4th,
they uncovered something that would soon become the most heavily debated piece of evidence in this case. The Soulmate simply ceased transmitting its position. To grasp why that is critical, we have to look at a system few people know about.
AIS, the Automatic Identification System.
Essentially, it acts as a boat's digital footprint. Its digital footprint out on the water. The AIS system constantly broadcasts a vessel's details, tracking its identity, location, heading, and speed. Nearby ships can track it. Shore-based stations can see it. Entire global maritime networks can watch it. Crucially, these networks archive all that data, every single transmission, path, and recorded coordinate. To investigators, this data is priceless, especially since human memory can easily fail. Witnesses get confused, and their stories often change over time. But electronic tracking logs are different. They log every single movement in real time, minute by minute, coordinate by coordinate, which is exactly why the events of April 4th instantly raised red flags. Maritime tracking records reviewed during the investigation show that Soulmate was broadcasting normally all evening. Then, at precisely 9:29 p.m., the transmission suddenly cut out. Not 9:28, not around 9:30, but exactly 9:29 p.m. That level of precision is critical because detectives aren't working with a vague timeline. They have a pinpoint moment in time, occurring the very night Lynette Hooker vanished. At first glance, that might seem ordinary. After all, marine electronics can fail, and signals get dropped. Devices malfunction, but investigators quickly spotted a vital detail. AIS systems are built to run continuously,
especially under the challenging conditions sailors face out on the water at night.
Open seas, poor visibility, and shifting weather. Those are precisely the conditions AIS was made for. That is why detectives focused not just on the disappearance itself, but on this sudden, silent gap in data. Because the moment the feed cut out, a new problem emerged. A massive gap opened in the timeline, and from that point on, all passive tracking records vanished. The boat could no longer be tracked using those standard marine surveillance systems that had monitored its journey earlier that night, and this timing was impossible to ignore. According to her husband Brian Hooker, Lynette was already in the deep water by then. She was already gone. The desperate search for truth had already started. Yet, this was precisely when the yacht's electronic trail suddenly went cold and hard to trace. Naturally, investigators demanded answers. Was there a logical explanation for this? Was it highly suspicious or directly tied to her disappearance? Or was it just a terrible coincidence on the worst possible night of their lives? These questions grew more critical as the police investigation deepened. Because one thing detectives learn very quickly is that timelines are everything. In complex cases, the timeline ultimately becomes the entire case. Forget what witnesses remember or believe. What matters is what can actually be placed on a clock. What can you prove? What can you measure? Now, investigators held a precise timestamp demanding attention,
9:29 p.m. The instant Soulmate vanished from tracking systems, making an already incredibly tough investigation far more complicated.
And perhaps most critically, it marked a dark window of time that detectives still cannot piece together using AIS data.
Because once that signal cut out, the vessel effectively went dark. No position updates, no visible tracking trail, absolutely nothing. As the hours crawled by, the darkness only deepened.
The search for Lynette grew urgent. And out there on the dark Abaco waters, the Soulmate slipped past the very maritime tracking systems that had been monitoring its path just hours before.
But the next morning brought a sudden shift.
The tracking signal flickered back online. When detectives finally looked into what happened during those lost hours, they realized this tracking blackout was just one piece of a darker puzzle. Another stream of digital forensics was silently recording that night, and the data it saved would spark a whole new set of questions. By this stage of the active investigation, police knew they weren't dealing with a typical missing person case anymore.
Instead, they faced a timeline with a massive gap in it.
And not just any gap, an 11-hour void. The exact kind of discrepancy detectives seize on because it sits right in the heart of the critical timeline. Look back at that crucial timestamp, 9:29 p.m. That is when the yacht's tracking system went totally dark.
Then,
According to GPS tracking records,
Later scrutinized by investigators, the boat vanished from all radar screens until around 8:40 the next morning, 11 hours and 11 minutes later.
no public tracking data exists. No electronic breadcrumbs to trace the vessel's path through the night. Just a starting point and an end.
For homicide detectives, that silence became evidence itself.
Not because a dropped signal proves a crime. It doesn't. But because every solid investigation relies on one core rule.
When vital data vanishes during the most critical hours of a timeline, you have to ask why.
Consider what police were dealing with. A woman is gone. Her last movements were on the ocean, and the main boat involved suddenly stops broadcasting its location. And this sudden silence starts during the exact window that detectives are desperate to reconstruct.
Naturally, they wanted answers. Transponders aren't just a convenience for modern mariners.
They exist for maritime safety, navigation, and total accountability.
out on the water.
Transponders help ships identify each other, prevent collisions, and log movements across open seas.
That is exactly why marine investigators scrutinize these logs.
These digital coordinates are often the closest thing to an unbiased witness. It is not human testimony. It is a machine, logging coordinates automatically as the night unfolds. When that critical data goes missing, it raises red flags, especially when trying to pinpoint exactly where a boat was during a critical window of time.
As the mystery began drawing major national news coverage, legal experts began dissecting the significance of the tracking blackout.
One critical voice was former federal prosecutor Tad DiBiase, and his perspective carried serious weight for a reason. DiBiase is not just some talking head analyzing a headline. He spent decades prosecuting complex trials, where circumstantial evidence and timeline reconstruction meant everything. More importantly,
He is an expert in so-called no-body homicide cases, investigations where prosecutors must prove a murder occurred even without a victim's remains.
as DiBiase analyzed the public evidence, he zeroed in on a question detectives always ask at the very start. Where was the vessel? Not where memory places it, nor where someone later claims it to be. Where was it physically located? That distinction is critical because every case has two timelines, the story people tell and the facts we can actually verify. Sometimes those two stories align, and sometimes they clash. When they clash, that is when detectives dig deeper. DiBiase openly called that tracking blackout highly suspicious, since it happened right when detectives were trying to piece things together. Now, this observation does not establish guilt.
It proves no crime, but it reveals why detectives remain obsessed with that blank window.
When you are reconstructing a disappearance at sea, GPS tracking data is absolute gold.
You need to know exactly where boats traveled.
When they drifted, when they sped up, and if the data backs up the story. But in this case, the vessel tracking system suddenly went completely dead. Then,
Hours later, it flickers back, like a crucial chapter torn right out of a thriller.
you see what happened before, you see what came after, but the center is completely blank.
And that missing window is precisely the time frame detectives need to decipher.
What was the Soulmate doing? Exactly where did it go? What actually happened on board during those silent, dark hours? At this point, police still lacked solid answers, but they did possess a major lead.
They had every reason to look past basic tracking records.
Because though the yacht's satellite tracker had gone completely dark, detectives would soon unearth a different digital footprint, silently recording in the shadows. Evidence that was never meant to see the light of day. Files that reportedly came straight from Brian Hooker's own device. And unlike the vessel tracking, this record did not vanish for 11 hours. Instead, it may have locked in a totally different version of events. Until now, police had been staring into a void of missing information. An 11-hour void where the Soulmate's tracking signals vanished entirely from the record. Then, the case pivoted dramatically when federal agents uncovered a new lead.
Something that was never supposed to be dragged into this investigation.
A hidden electronic trail, quietly tracking data in the background.
And unlike the boat's tracker, this trail did not stop at 9:29 p.m.
According to reports on the case, federal agents retrieved data from a marine navigation app on Brian Hooker's personal device.
To see why that is crucial, we must look at how these apps work.
Modern boating apps basically serve as digital chart plotters. They help captains plan routes, track GPS coordinates, and map journeys over open water, but they often perform another task entirely.
They record tracking data silently in the background.
You do not need to set a route or manually save your location coordinates. The app continuously logs exactly where the device travels, leaving a digital breadcrumb trail of your exact movements.
And that secret digital log would become one of the biggest breakthroughs in the entire investigation.
Based on details later revealed by CBS News,
investigators pulled GPS tracking data from Brian Hooker's personal device.
This record showed movement out on the water the night Lynette vanished. Even more critical, sources close to the case revealed these coordinates did not match the map Brian handed over to police. That contradiction is massive because up until this moment, detectives were mostly relying on a simple story. They had to trust Brian's version of events, his memory of different locations, and his claims of where things happened. But now they had a secondary source, one that did not rely on human memory. This digital footprint was not manufactured after the fact. It had been logging coordinates in real time as everything went down. Suddenly, detectives were not just comparing one witness story against another. They were matching a spoken story against hard data. Reports indicate those two timelines of that fateful night did not match up at all.
Consider what that actually means for a criminal investigation.
Think about trying to rebuild a crime scene. Someone tells you their exact location, but then surveillance footage proves they were miles away. That is the glaring discrepancy investigators immediately lock onto. Not because it guarantees guilt, but because contradictions raise serious questions. Questions demand verification, and verifying the facts pushes detectives closer to the truth.
For this case, the main question was incredibly simple.
If the tracking data does not align with the narrative provided, which version is the real story, the spoken route or the recorded track? And if there is a gap, why does it exist?
These doubts carry immense weight in open water cases because location is absolute.
Unlike a city street,
The ocean does not preserve evidence. There are no intersections, no security cameras, no witnesses walking by, and zero traffic logs.
Out on the deep blue, digital tracking is one of the only unbiased tools police have left.
It reconstructs timelines, tracks movement patterns, and pinpoints exact stops.
It also highlights course corrections and defines search grids.
That is why detectives place a massive premium on objective, digital evidence.
The sea might wash away physical clues, but digital footprints survive.
According to the files,
The retrieved tracking files showed the unit traveling through the Sea of Abaco, pausing and eventually heading back to land.
police reportedly determined these travel patterns did not match the maps Brian Hooker had originally given them.
Right now,
We must keep in mind what this digital trace cannot tell us.
It fails to reveal the fate of Lynette Hooker, and it yields no clear motive.
it does not prove criminal intent, nor does it resolve why the paths are different.
Yet, it delivers one crucial thing the police desperately required.
They finally held an unbiased record and an alternate timeline of that night.
Something completely separate from personal interviews, memories, or stories.
When detectives face two conflicting stories of the same night, they do not just pick one. They pressure test both, because somewhere in the middle lies the cold truth. At this point, the investigation was beginning to shift.
The case had shifted far beyond the disappearance itself.
Instead, investigators focused heavily on hard evidence, the AIS blackout, navigation data, and glaring timeline discrepancies. Every fresh lead kept dragging investigators back to one specific place. Straight back to the Soulmate. Because the deeper they dug into the digital footprint, the more they believed this vessel held the key to the entire mystery. By this point, investigators were handling far more than just a single missing person case.
They were piecing together a vast trail of digital evidence,
including that strange AIS blackout, GPS tracking data, and conflicting timelines.
And as those critical pieces piled up, the entire focus of the investigation turned back to a crucial presence that had been there from day one, the Soulmate itself. If Lynette Hooker vanished during the window of time claimed by Brian Hooker,
Then the boat was far more than just connected to the case.
it was central to everything. Every move, every electronic system, and every shred of onboard tech suddenly became critical.
And federal agents treated it exactly that way.
In early May, federal authorities officially seized the Soulmate.
For the first time since Lynette vanished, investigators seized total control of the ship and every device on board. That aggressive action alone tells us something critical. Federal agencies do not impound and strip search a yacht of this size just because it was near the scene. They do it because they believe the boat holds physical proof that can reconstruct exactly what happened. By this point, reconstructing the truth had become their primary mission. No theories, no assumptions. Just hard facts. Investigators needed to know where the yacht sailed and which systems were running. What data was actively recorded, and if any of those logs could explain the massive gaps in the timeline. Initially, the yacht stayed in Florida, but agents soon moved it to a secure facility designed for high-level forensic analysis. That relocation might sound routine, but it reveals that detectives were planning far more than a basic walkthrough. They were setting up for an incredibly thorough forensic teardown. Think about the sheer amount of tech on a modern sailboat. GPS plotters, navigation hubs, marine electronics, satellite communicators, onboard computers, hard drives, apps tracking user locations, and system logs operating silently in the background. Most people still view boats as simple mechanical vessels, but modern yachts actually function like floating data centers. Every voyage leaves a trail, and every device keeps score. Investigators wanted everything, because, unlike human memory, digital records never fade or get confused over time. They never forget. They do not change their story months later.
When secured correctly, they give investigators a concrete timeline that can be scientifically verified.
That is why securing the Soulmate was so critical.
Not because agents believed the hull itself could speak, but because the onboard technology definitely could.
And that difference matters.
A vessel cannot talk, but its systems, navigation logs, and internal hard drives absolutely can.
But its stored records can.
When handling complex cases, especially mysterious disappearances at sea, detectives often turn to technology to bridge the gaps that human memories leave behind.
And by this point, those gaps were massive. Unanswered questions about movement and timing. Mysteries of location that could only be solved by digital data, not unreliable human memories. When federal agents first boarded the vessel, they locked their focus onto those exact systems. They seized GPS logs, electronics, and digital drives, anything that could track what happened before, during, or after Lynette vanished. Their mission was clear: piece together a highly detailed timeline of events, tracing every single minute, every slight movement,
And analyzing every bite, because investigators believed the truth was buried somewhere in that timeline.
That is when detectives turn their attention to a specific device aboard the Soulmate.
A system that might have been silently recording while everything else went wrong.
An instrument that has no need for daylight.
A lens that records whether anyone realizes it is watching or not.
If it was running that night, it could have captured crucial moments that absolutely nobody knew were being recorded.
At this stage, police had gathered several key parts of a highly complex puzzle.
They mapped the AIS blackout. They held navigation logs recovered from onboard computers. They had a timeline full of gaps, and they now held the vessel itself. Yet, another specialized tool on board the ship was drawing intense scrutiny. This gear functions entirely differently from standard marine navigation systems. Satellite GPS or tracking units. Because unlike those devices, this camera does not map a vessel's path. Instead, it records what it observes, or more precisely, what it detects. This thermal imaging is called FLIR, short for forward-looking infrared. Experienced boaters often use FLIR as a crucial safety aid during night operations.
To see why, picture standing on a boat's deck in pitch-black darkness.
No coastal lights, no shorelines, absolutely zero landmarks, just endless dark water. Standard video cameras are useless here because they need visible light to function. But thermal technology acts differently. Rather than capturing light, it tracks heat. Everything radiates heat. The ocean does, boats do, and human bodies definitely do. A thermal camera translates these heat signatures into clear images, uncovering details completely hidden from the human eye. That is why these FLIR systems have become incredibly popular among mariners operating after dark. They spot distant boats, navigation hazards, debris floating nearby, and sometimes even lost swimmers, especially when thick fog rolls in. For marine detectives, this raises one glaring question. Was that FLIR camera running on the Soulmate the night Lynette Hooker went missing? And if so, what exactly did it capture? Right here, we must draw a very strict line between proven facts and total speculation. Because this is exactly where rumors outpace actual evidence. We know for certain that official reports state the Soulmate had an operational infrared camera system on board. And we know federal investigators seized the vessel and immediately began analyzing the electronic equipment recovered on board. Multiple reports now suggest that key evidence from the ship is currently being analyzed in this federal investigation. What remains a mystery, at least publicly, is what that camera actually captured. If it recorded anything, investigators haven't released the footage. They haven't described any video publicly, nor have they shared results from analyzing the infrared thermal imaging system. That distinction is absolutely crucial. Because right now, the camera matters not for what it has shown,
but for what it might be capable of revealing. Think about the massive challenge investigators face. The critical events in this case allegedly took place at night on the open water without any independent eyewitnesses.
There were no surveillance cameras nearby, no public security systems pointing toward the area. Those dark conditions create massive evidentiary hurdles.
But a thermal imaging camera, if operational, changes the entire game. Unlike a witness, it doesn't forget. Unlike a human, it never misinterprets events. It simply captures whatever passes through its field of view.
And that is why detectives are scrutinizing every piece of onboard technology, hoping each device offers a way to verify,
Challenge or clarify parts of the timeline.
By this point, the inquiry had grown far beyond a simple missing person case.
Federal agencies were now involved.
Digital evidence was being examined. Electronic records were being thoroughly scanned.
And according to reports on the case, some forensics were being handled at specialized labs capable of high-level digital examinations. The ultimate goal stayed the same: figuring out what happened on the night of April 4th.
But investigators were no longer leaning on just one source of truth. They were reconstructing the timeline from several angles at once. AIS records, GPS data, personal electronics, and camera footage.
Each new source adding another layer of context.
Each piece of data helping detectives verify facts independently, because that is how complex cases are solved.
One small clue at a time.
One record at a time, building to one undeniable fact. By this stage, investigators finally had something they lacked at the start. Not direct answers, but real options. Multiple streams of evidence. Different ways to reconstruct that night, and multiple chances to confirm which timeline details hold up and which remain a mystery.
Investigators now had tracking data,
GPS data, personal electronics, and potentially thermal video.
The real question was no longer about having information.
It was about what those digital files would ultimately reveal. And more importantly, where this federal case was heading next.
At this stage, a major shift was happening behind closed doors. The team was no longer just reviewing the evidence they had gathered.
They were starting to act on what those clues revealed. When that happens, it usually means a case has entered a critical new phase.
Because digital files have no value on their own, the power is where they lead.
And according to reports on this federal probe,
fresh analysis of the data was finally pointing investigators toward highly specific locations. Deep within the waters of the Bahamas, spots they desperately wanted to inspect.
This shift is critical because for months the team had only been working backward, digging through files,
analyzing recovered devices, and rebuilding timelines to reconstruct what happened on April 4th.
But now,
the mystery was turning forward, using hard digital evidence to pinpoint physical locations that might hold the answers.
One specific search zone drawing intense focus is a stretch of the Sea of Abaco near Elbow Cay and Hopetown.
based on local case reports.
Detectives pushed for warrants to launch new dive operations in a sector flagged by GPS tracking data. And that detail is highly revealing.
Deepwater operations are never done on a whim. They are incredibly costly, slow,
and logistically punishing, especially when coordinating multiple federal and local agencies.
Before launching a massive search operation, authorities require concrete, evidence-based leads to justify the budget.
At this stage of the investigation, forensic evidence was their only compass. Not internet rumors, not theories, but hard facts.
Because every single dive site they target represents a vital question they need answered. What went down here? Why this specific stretch of water?
Is there something resting on the seabed that finally explains the night Lynette vanished? Meanwhile, behind the scenes, another silent move was playing out, one that got far less press than the GPS track or the AIS transponder blackout, but holds massive weight. Federal agents quietly asked Lynette Hooker's family for DNA reference samples.
To an outsider, that sounds deeply ominous, but in truth,
It is standard routine police work.
for missing person files that drag on month after month.
Genetic profiles let forensic teams confirm a positive identification if biological material or remains are ever recovered. It is one of the most definitive forensic tools in the book.
And though gathering DNA does not guarantee a tragic outcome, it underscores just how seriously federal authorities are taking this active investigation. Because at this point, they are no longer just looking for a missing person.
They are trying to reconstruct a potential crime scene. And that shift becomes clear when looking at the massive response.
Look at the teams involved: the Coast Guard Investigative Service, the FBI, elite forensic specialists, and local police force.
These distinct groups are pulling together different puzzle pieces of one case.
Some tracking physical clues, others tracing electronic footprints, while dive teams map out potential recovery sites. On their own, none of these clues give us a smoking gun.
But combined, they build a chilling pattern. Detectives are not pinning this entire case on one single lead.
They are layering ship tracking records, satellite GPS data,
Boat hardware, deep water mapping, lab tests, and DNA samples, using every trace to test and perfect their master timeline. Because that is what this mystery has evolved into, a forensic search to map out exactly who was where. What went wrong? And if the physical evidence actually backs up the story told to the public. At this point, detectives had gathered more evidence than at any other stage of the investigation. But cold, hard facts alone cannot solve a mystery.
It must be linked, cross-referenced, verified, and built into a timeline that actually makes sense. And that is precisely what investigators are doing now, piece by piece, location by location,
record by record, chasing answers to a mystery that lingers months after Lynette Hooker disappeared.
What really happened on the night of April 4th? Because the deeper detectives dug, the clearer it became. This was no longer just a missing person case.
It was a race to reconstruct a timeline. And that timeline grew sharper with every single piece of evidence they recovered.
Let us go back to the start. April 4th, 2025, Hopetown, Bahamas. A husband and wife push off from shore in a small dinghy. For them, it should have been a routine run, a trip they had likely made 1,000 times before. Just one more short trip back to the sailboat they called home. But somewhere between Hopetown and the Soulmate, something went wrong. According to Brian Hooker's account, Lynette somehow ended up in the water.
He claims she was carrying the dinghy's ignition key, leaving him completely unable to restart the engine.
He says he tried desperately to reach her.
And he claims the wind and currents swept them apart until she vanished completely. That is where this story begins.
But it is definitely not where the investigation ends.
Because once detectives started examining the evidence, the focus shifted from human memory to raw digital records. First was the timestamp at 9:29 p.m.
The exact moment the Soulmate stopped transmitting its location data. Then came that critical 11-hour gap, a total blackout of tracking data during the most crucial window of the case. Then came the GPS data.
Information recovered directly from a marine navigation app. Data that officials say did not align with the maps Brian Hooker had previously given to authorities. Then, federal agents seized the boat itself. Authorities taking full possession of the Soulmate,
scrutinizing navigation systems, downloading digital logs, and stripping down equipment that records data long after a voyage ends.
And finally, they focused on the infrared camera,
a device designed to capture activity in pitch blackness, which forensic investigators deemed crucial enough to include in their review. When you connect all of these pieces, a clear pattern emerges. Not a conclusion,
Not a verdict, a pattern.
a pattern showing detectives rely much more on hard digital evidence than on any one person's story.
Because that is the heart of this case, a search for the absolute truth of the timeline.
And at the center of that timeline lies the exact same mystery that has haunted this case from day one.
What happened during those 11 hours?
What happened after the tracking signal went dark?
What took place between 9:29 p.m. and the next morning?
Because despite everything investigators have gathered, that window remains the most crucial and least understood part of the entire mystery. And it is worth keeping in mind that as of today, we still have no final answers. This investigation is still active. Detectives are still analyzing evidence. Official conclusions haven't been released. No suspects have been convicted of any crime involving Lynette Hooker going missing. And the most critical questions are still left unanswered.
Which is why every single breakthrough matters. Every data point, every forensic test,
Every rescue sweep.
Every tactical decision. Because each clue might finally lock down a timeline detectives are desperately trying to reconstruct.
To the public,
This story seems to be about a missing person, but for detectives, the focus has shifted to something else entirely.
A timeline reconstructed from GPS records and AIS tracking data.
Digital devices, forensic testing, and crucial evidence that hasn't been shared with the public yet.
a timeline starting as a couple leaves Hopetown together, only to shatter at exactly 9:29 p.m. on April 4th, when the Soulmate suddenly goes dark.
What really occurred during those blank hours remains the single biggest mystery in this entire investigation. I want to hear your theories on this. Which specific clue do you think is the most critical so far? The AIS tracking blackout, the GPS discrepancies, the forensic sweep of the vessel, or the infrared camera footage? Please keep the chat respectful. Stick to verified facts. And remember, this is still an active case with a real family desperately searching for answers. As new updates come in, we'll keep following this evidence wherever it leads.